Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was all about centrifuges, industrial spinning tubes designed to enrich uranium and crucial to making a nuclear bomb. 5 years ago, Iran was set to spin thousands of them, but the deal brokered in 2015 stopped almost all of them, and with them, Iran's nuclear program was frozen. But Donald Trump has never liked it, once even labeling it as insane. Today, he has the chance to pull his country out of the Iran nuclear agreement for good. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, is amongst many who've urged him to stay along with the other signatories. The leaders of Israel and Saudi Arabia have egged him on to pull out. Well, our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris is waiting for the president's announcement outside the White House. Kylie.
Yes, Matt, these things don't always run to time, so we're still waiting. But I think it's fair to say that time is running out for this deal. There is lots of different reporting in this moment, much of it based around a phone call to President Macron this morning from the White House, from President Trump. Initially, the New York Times was reporting that President Trump had told Emmanuel Macron, who you mentioned, they are such great mates. He was here just 2 weeks ago lobbying for the deal to survive. Apparently, President Trump, according to the New York Times, told him that that isn't going to happen. Since then, we've heard from Paris that that isn't what he was told. We're also hearing some reporting from congressional leaders or from congressional leaders having been briefed by the White House and being told that there will be a decision to reimpose sanctions on Iran, but there may be kind of 6 months time lag in that decision actually being implemented, which might mean that the European allies could come up with some other kind of a deal. So, as is the way of these things, there is still some deal of confusion about this, but the president's intention is clear. He is determined to kind of signal the death knell for this deal. He wants this signature foreign policy achievement of his predecessor, of President Obama, undone, and that is what he is determined to prove today.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into.
For those who signed it, this was a deal for the ages, a shared commitment to peace, to make the world safer. But in just 2 years, its greatest opponent has shredded the Iran nuclear treaty with his rhetoric, lambasting its inadequacies, bemoaning its conditions, using the full force of his power to tear it down.
Never, ever have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran.
What will you tell the president about the Iran nuclear deal?
With the deal on life support, allies led by France rushed to revive it. With the decision to sabotage the deal, Donald Trump would restore hostility toward Tehran as the preferred setting for a United States president. After all, the history of tension between the two nations is long. Since the Iranian Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, iconic images of flag burning and mobs whipped up by angry clerics overseen by Ayatollah Khomeini have seeped into the American memory. When students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 50 American diplomats hostage for the next 444 days, it cast the Democratic leadership of Jimmy Carter as weak and ineffectual. They were released on the day Republican Ronald Reagan became president, and for many Republicans, a hostile stance toward Tehran has been the only answer ever since. Overlay that with a new generation of conservative generals for whom their wartime experience of American soldiers killed by Iranian proxies in the Iraq War prompted a new bitterness toward Tehran. And so it felt seismic, not only that negotiations began, but that in July 2015 they ended in success. It had been an imperfect, rancorous, but ultimately triumphant joint effort. Not only Iran and the US, but Britain and France and Germany, China and Russia.
Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive, long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. This deal demonstrates that American diplomacy can bring about real and meaningful change. Change that makes our country and the world safer and more secure. This deal is also in line with a tradition of American leadership.
Former Secretary of State John Kerry described where things stood in 2013 when he first sat down for talks with Iran's foreign minister.
On that day, Iran had gone from 164 centrifuges under George W. Bush to 27,000 centrifuges. On that day, there were 12,000 kilograms of stockpiled enriched uranium, which, if they took the next step, was enough uranium for 10 to 12 bombs. They were a couple of months away from commissioning a plutonium reactor, which would have produced enough plutonium-grade, weapons-grade plutonium for 2 bombs a year.
That was then. Here's what the deal signed in July 2015 achieved: a reduction in the number of centrifuges from 19,000 to 5,000, a commitment not to enrich uranium for 15 years, a stockpile of uranium diminished by 98%, and a breakout time, that's the time it would take Tehran to build a bomb, slowed from a matter of months to 1 full year. But for President Trump, it was all an insult, a cash donation to Iran, a poorly monitored deal redundant because of time limits and abused by Tehran from the start.
We will not continue down a path whose predictable conclusion is more violence, more terror, and the very real threat of Iran's nuclear breakout.
Iran hawks John Bolton and Mike Pompeo now sit within the president's inner circle, with the White House prioritising alliances with Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's already killed the deal. Now it's all about making funeral arrangements. So we're still waiting on the president. He announced by Twitter 24 hours ago that this announcement was going to take place. So there's a little something of the reality TV drama about all of this. But we'll come straight back to you as soon as he does speak. Meanwhile, it's back to you, Matt, in London.
Thanks, Kylie, and we'll be hearing more from Kylie later. Now, fresh from his Washington trip, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has criticised Downing Street's favoured proposal for a post-Brexit customs partnership. Crazy was the epithet he chose to describe the plan. On top of that, a vote in the House of Lords further threatens to derail the government's hopes of a smooth journey to Brexit Day. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster now. Gary, what is Boris Johnson up to? Is he on his way out?
Friends of Boris Johnson are saying he doesn't intend to resign, but you have to say, looking at the interview he gave and the place that he put it, that he really is rocking the boat in this government at the moment. He chose the Daily Mail, the Theresa May's favourite newspaper, her sort of pet supporter. It has been in the past to accuse her of running a crazy idea. Short of putting a post-it on a kettle, I'm not sure he could have caught her attention better in the morning, and I'm sure that was his intention. Another cabinet minister has told me that Boris Johnson isn't the only one who's rattling the cage on trying to kill off the partnership idea that Theresa May is still pushing as her solution to the customs union problem. And a third of cabinet ministers, one cabinet minister told me, are ready to walk out if she persists with it. So it does look at the moment, there's a gathering about to start at 7:30 of MPs who support the Boris Johnson line, members of the European Research Group. I'm sure that's going to be a bit of a rallying moment for them. It does look as though at the moment Theresa May, you'd guess, is going to have to back down because she's knocked Boris Johnson back in the past through Number 10 spokesmen and spokeswomen when he said something out of turn, and very ominously, I think, for those who are her defenders and supporters, and maybe for Remainers in the cabinet, she didn't do that today. And I think they might be looking at a cabinet committee meeting on Brexit in not this week but the week after. But it could be around then. It's just possible that Theresa May ends up backing down on something that she said she wouldn't.
Gary Gibbon there at the House of Commons. Thanks very much indeed. Kylie Morris is still at the White House, and joining me here is our diplomatic editor, Lindsay Hilsum. Lindsay, first of all to you, I mean, you've been following the Iran deal, when it was actually made for goodness knows how many years. What has propelled him to do this, do you think? I mean, assuming that he will either limit it or scrap it. Is it his domestic base? Is it his closeness to Israel? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it all of the above?
Well, I think, as Kylie was saying earlier, the main thing is destroying the legacy of his predecessor, Barack Obama, but he is also very much influenced by the Israelis. Now, the Europeans, Boris Johnson was there at the weekend trying to persuade the Americans not to do this. Emmanuel Macron before that, Angela Merkel before that. And this morning, senior officials from those three countries were in Brussels talking to the Iranian deputy foreign minister. What they're trying to do is see if there's any way that they can salvage the deal, even if the Americans pull right out of it. But that's not easy, because what it requires is for European companies to go and invest in Iran. And if there are secondary sanctions, meaning that a European company that invests in Iran then gets sanctioned by the Americans, well, which is the bigger market? Which is more important? It could destroy the deal completely.
Kylie, any sign of him yet?
Not as yet. Just to echo, though, what Lindsay was saying, certainly you can be in no doubt as to the kind of pressure the Europeans have been trying to exert on President Trump in the past few weeks. We've seen a parade of leaders, President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, Boris Johnson at the weekend, all with the same message. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I understand, actually, he's just about to appear, just about to begin to speak. So let's hear what he says.
Today, I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Over the years, Iran and its proxies have bombed American embassies and military installations, murdered hundreds of American service members, and kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured American citizens. The Iranian regime has funded its long reign of chaos and terror by plundering the wealth of its own people. No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them. In 2015, the previous administration joined with other nations in a deal regarding Iran's nuclear program. This agreement was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime. In fact, the deal allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium and, over time, reach the brink of a nuclear breakout. The deal lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for very weak limits on the regime's nuclear activity and no limits at all on its other malign behavior, including its sinister activities in Syria, Yemen, and other places all around the world. In other words, at the point when the United States had maximum leverage, this disastrous deal gave this regime, and it's a regime of great terror, many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash. A great embarrassment to me as a citizen and to all citizens of the United States. A constructive deal could easily have been struck at the time, but it wasn't. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Today, we have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie. Last week, Israel published intelligence documents, long concealed by Iran, conclusively showing the Iranian regime and its history of pursuing nuclear weapons. The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget has grown by almost 40%.
while its economy is doing very badly. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond. The agreement was so poorly negotiated that even if Iran fully complies, the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. If I allowed this deal to stand, there would soon be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Everyone would want their weapons ready by the time Iran had theirs. Making matters worse, the deal's inspection provisions lack adequate mechanisms to prevent, detect, and punish cheating, and don't even have the unqualified right to inspect many important locations, including military facilities. Not only does the deal fail to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it also fails to address the regime's development of ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads. Finally, the deal does nothing to constrain Iran's destabilizing activities, including its support for terrorism. Since the agreement, Iran's bloody ambitions have grown only more brazen. In light of these glaring flaws, I announced last October that the Iran deal must either be renegotiated or terminated. 3 months later, on January 12th, I repeated these conditions. I made clear that if the deal could not be fixed, the United States would no longer be a party to the agreement. Over the past few months, we have engaged extensively with our allies and partners around the world, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. We have also consulted with our friends from across the Middle East. We are unified in our understanding of the threat and in our conviction that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. After these consultations, it is clear to me that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement. The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments.
Okay, Donald Trump there speaking at the White House just now. Lindsay Hilsum, our international editor, this is a bombshell, isn't it? I mean, we sort of expected this, but still hearing him say that the deal is dead is big, big news.
He was basically echoing the Israeli Prime Minister. This is the Israeli line. This was very interesting. He said he didn't like the sunset provisions. That means the allowance for Iran to start its nuclear program, not its nuclear bomb. It has always said it wasn't building a bomb. Its nuclear program in 10 years or so time. What he has done now means that Iran may well start its nuclear program again within a month. My Iranian sources tell me they're going to give a month for the Europeans to try and persuade the Americans otherwise. That's what I was told a week or so ago. But after that, centrifuges start spinning, inspections stop, it will all go again. This is a very dangerous moment.
And very briefly, before we listen to your report, a lot of what he said just wasn't true.
Oh, much of it wasn't true. He said a constructive deal could easily have been struck at the time. I spent a lot of time with those negotiators on all sides. This deal was very hard won, and it was working. The Iranians were in compliance.
Let's listen to your piece.
Today, the Iranian president was trying to reassure oil and gas executives who fear the reimposition of sanctions. Iran can stand on its own 2 feet, he said, whatever President Trump does.
Exceptional circumstances can occur at any time. It's possible that a particular person comes to power in a country and creates an extraordinary situation. These things happen, but we'll get through it. We may face some problems for 2 or 3 months, but we'll manage these issues. The basis of our policy is to have constructive engagement with the rest of the world.
Rouhani, we love you, they chanted when he signed the nuclear deal back in 2015. He staked his political future on it, as did his foreign minister Javad Zarif. Iranians feted them for clinching the agreement, which they hoped would bring prosperity and peace. But last December, Iranians started to protest. The economy has improved since the deal, but most people haven't yet felt the benefit. Now the currency is losing value, and renewed sanctions will make everything worse. Last month, President Macron went to Washington to try to convince President Trump to stay within the deal. They spoke by phone this morning, the French in concert with other Europeans, saying there's no good alternative.
Although the deal may not be perfect, it nonetheless has advantages. The first one being that it suspends a nuclear program that was not by design peaceful. The second one is that it allows for very strict and regular monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Iranians are in compliance.
For once, Europe and Russia are united against the USA.
It would be very harmful for international stability to break such an important accord, because on the one hand it can really destabilize the region, on the other hand give Iran reasons to resume the nuclear program, and that is not in anyone's interest.
Iran lied. Big time.
But it's the Israeli leader who President Trump listens to most. Last week, Prime Minister Netanyahu used intelligence from the early 2000s to make a case for ditching the deal. It didn't convince the Europeans, nor even some members of his own Secret Service, but it was addressed to an audience of 1.
The Iran deal, the nuclear deal, is based on lies.
The Tehran Book Fair today. Trump's The Art of the Deal has been translated into Persian. Now he could write The Art of Destroying the Deal. Trump's decision makes no difference, said one bookseller. The idea of America as the enemy is rooted in us. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, always said Iran shouldn't trust the Americans. Hardliners like him and former President Ahmadinejad, seen here inspecting nuclear facilities, are strengthened by today's announcement. The nuclear deal was hard to negotiate, but it's easy to destroy. Iran kept its word, but the Americans wrecked it anyway.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Walid Fares, who was foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign. Thanks for coming on the program, Mr. Fares. Presumably, you're quite pleased by what you heard today.
Well, yes, I am. Basically, the president withdrew from the Iran deal. But regardless of we are against or for, what is important for the public is to understand what is actually happened and why it did happen. What has actually happened is that the U.S. Administration, at least backed by some influential members of Congress, wants to get out of this specific deal, not of the principle of a deal with Iran. And right. I think soon enough they're going to call for other negotiations for a future deal.
But when you're trying to get out of a deal as important as this one, and you're making your pitch to the American public and indeed to the world, it does help, does it not, to get the facts right. Now, President Trump here said that Iran supported the Taliban and al-Qaeda. You know as well as I know, that's just not true. But he put it out there as part of his case against them. It's not true. He talked about the continuing bombings against American targets. The American embassy in Beirut was bombed in 1982. These are historic crimes against America. So a lot of the stuff was just wrong. What's your reaction to that?
I don't have a reaction to that. There are facts that could be countered by facts. Yes, that
No, but there's some facts are true and some are false.
Yes, sir. There are multiple visions, multiple arguments, multiple views. I am presenting a view, and I need to develop that view. So my view is that, yes, indeed, the United States and Iran have been locked in a conflict since 1982, indeed. And it's not just the Hezbollah attacks against the embassy, but Hezbollah and Iran have been engaging with the United States in Iraq, by the way, with the British as well, and all the way till very recently. That agreement, I know that, and I admit, froze some of the Iranians' actions against the United States directly. But on the ground in the Middle East, the Iranians expanded in Iraq, in Syria, where they are supporting the Assad regime, which is very much criticized by the international community, in Lebanon and in Yemen. So there are some facts that the president is basing his judgment on to say that we have a crisis to solve. He's not saying that we are against Iran because we don't like Iran, because there is a conflict that needs to be resolved.
Is this a very kind of complicated and perhaps brilliant bargaining tactic, where the president is trying to basically push Iran against the wall and say, let's renegotiate this treaty from the beginning? Or do you think that at the end of the day, what he really wants is a military showdown with Iran?
I would go for option one. I mean, I know the critics of the United States and those who oppose specifically this administration believe that he's doing this just to do a showdown. And some even are advancing the argument that he is doing it for other countries, should it be Saudi Arabia or Israel. I mean, this is a thesis. In my view, in my understanding, he's a man, he's a leader who actually likes transactions, and he is moving out from this agreement, most likely because he's going to propose another agreement. And he already shared those ideas with the 3 European leaders who visited him over the past month.
But this does leave America very isolated amongst its friends, doesn't it?
It does, yes. It's very much calculated. In the past, we've seen examples where the United States took bold actions. It was isolated, but with time, it went back with its allies, because what unifies the transatlantic alliance is much larger than one agreement with one country in the Middle East. For example, when President Macron came to Washington, he was very clear that he was with the agreement. Our president was against the agreement. They agreed on 2 things at least. One is to go against the missiles, and then 2, to go against terrorism. And I think this is the same position with Germany and Great Britain. So there is a way to bring back the alliance on other grounds.
Okay, Walid Faraz in Washington, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now from Baltimore is Vali Nasser, a noted Iran expert and Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and from Tehran, Professor of Political Sciences, Nasser Hadian. Good morning, good afternoon to you both. Let's turn to you, first of all, Professor Hadian, in Tehran. What's the reaction going to be to this?
Of course, we may have a different reactions. We might have had a different reactions had President Trump basically have done the nuclear, the withdrawal in other ways. In other words, the soft exit might have provoked a different reaction from Iran. But the way he reacted and the withdrawal, I guess there is going to be a unified reaction from Iran, and that would be condemnation of President Trump, and the population of Iran are going to rally behind what President Rouhani is going to announce tonight.
Is the lesson from all this, especially looking at how North Korea has been treated, that if you have nuclear weapons, you're going to be invited possibly to the White House and to a state banquet, but if you don't have them, then you're going to be in trouble, and that therefore Iran will try and develop them as quickly as possible?
That is one scenario, but of course we will decide on the basis of our own national interests, what would serve our national interests. So far, our national interests have been served, but not developing nuclear weapons, because we think that would generate an arms race in the region. So I definitely would like to go toward the path of weaponization of our nuclear weapons.
Okay, Vali Nasser, let's turn to you. I mean, how dead is this deal now, and where does this leave America?
Well, I think the language that President Trump used in explaining the reason he's withdrawing makes it very difficult to see how there can be a comeback anytime soon. I think, Iran, under the terms of the deal, has a right to complain to Federica Mogherini, the European foreign policy chief. That will kick off a 30 to 45-day process of reviewing Iran's complaint. That 30 to 45 days gives Europeans a chance to try to find a way to keep at least their portion of the deal alive. If after the 45 days there's no resolution, then under the terms of the deal, Iran is free to leave the deal. Now, the language President Trump used makes it very difficult to think that the European can get anything out of him. And I think that essentially leads to a point that even if Iran thinks there's a renegotiation to happen, they would assume that they better have very strong leverage when they go back to the table. And one option, as you mentioned, is to move out of the NPT agreement, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Agreement, and basically make their nuclear program a much bigger threat. And then all of the issues that the president complained about, Iran's activities in the region, they're all going to be much more difficult to manage once Iran is outside of the nuclear deal than when it was inside the nuclear deal.
But to what extent can the Europeans, as they have signaled, continue with this deal if America is not on board, especially when we know that America, following its own laws, punishes those countries that do deals with places like Iran that it doesn't do deals with itself? Vali Nasser. Hello, can you hear me, Vali Nasser? Hello? Okay, let me turn to you again, Professor Hadian. What I was trying to get at there is, you may hope that France and Germany can carry on dealing with you, even if the Americans don't. But to what extent do you think that's possible when American administrations have punished those countries that have carried on dealing with countries that have been sanctioned by them?
Of course, you have to ask that question from the Europeans. But I think the possibility of them to deliver on the promises they have made still is high. Because there used to be such a situation in 1996, 1997, and Europe adopted a policy called blocking regulations. So they can come up with a mechanism and measures to deal with the current situation. If they can convince Iranians that, okay, they are going to deliver on their promises, there is a good chance that Iran still stay. Just very briefly,
sorry to interrupt, one final very brief question. Are you afraid that this will lead to a wider conflict now in the Middle East?
Surely, because if the Europe cannot deliver, no doubt, the absolute majority of Iranian elites and the government officials are going to call for withdrawal, not only from the JCPOA, but rather from the NPT. And then there is not going to be any monitoring. There is not going to be any limit. Iran is going to expand its nuclear activities. Then they are going to renegotiate from a position of strength.
Okay, got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Professor Hadian, thank you very much indeed. Fatima. Tonight's main news, the deal is dead, the Iran deal, that is. President Trump has announced that he's turning his back on the Iran nuclear agreement, saying the Iranian promise was a lie. In a minute, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. But first, back to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. Kylie.
Matt, we've got some reaction coming in. Samantha Power, who was, of course, Barack Obama's ambassador to the UN at the time that the deal was negotiated, has said that this is a catastrophic decision by President Trump, that it's devastating to America's credibility globally. President Rouhani has already responded, saying that America never fulfilled its obligations. That's all we've heard from him so far. We know that these sanctions potentially will be back in place already within 90 days. US Treasury will begin to reapply some of these sanctions. As for Europe, Federica Mogherini says they are still in this deal. The EU is still in this deal, regardless of President Trump's decision today. President Macron has tweeted to say that he is disappointed, not only on behalf of France, but also of Germany and the UK. Mike Pompeo is en route, we understand, to Pyongyang to begin another round of nuclear negotiations. But for now, this deal is dead.
Thanks, Kylie. Well, let's go to the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Tom Tugendhat, thanks for coming on the programme. I mean, here we had Donald Trump basically, give a speech that was full of inaccuracies, some might even say lies about what Iran had been doing in the last few years. And it sounds as if he is, gunning for a fight with Iran. Are we back in the situation that we were in with Iraq, where we have to watch a conflict being started based on half-truths?
Well, look, I think we're in a different situation, actually. I think we're in a situation where we've got to make sure that we realise that this deal is not just a deal between the United States and Iran. It's a deal between many countries, including the United Kingdom. In fact, as Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond signed this deal on behalf of the United Kingdom, the European Union under Mogherini and indeed France and Germany also signed this deal. So this isn't just a US-Iranian deal, this is a wider deal than that. Now, I realise the importance of the US contribution to this deal, of course I do, and it would be absurd to belittle it. But the reality is that this is an opportunity for the European countries who believe that there is a possibility to stand up here to make a difference. And I actually think that there's also a possibility that we could work with the United States to find a different approach.
But we had the Foreign Secretary pleading with Donald Trump on Fox television, flattering him by saying he might get the Nobel Peace Prize. And we have seen the limits of that flattery. What does that say about us and them?
Well, let's not forget that President Macron went to, on a state visit, went to the United States.
But none of it worked.
Well, indeed, it doesn't seem to have seen President Trump agreeing that this deal is worth continuing. But I think that there are many of us who think that is a shame. Now, I spoke out against the deal when it was initially signed, but then because I wasn't a huge supporter of the way in which it was done. But once you've done a deal like this, sticking to it does actually matter. It's to do with international credibility.
Okay, in 20 seconds, do you think that President Trump might be playing a blinder here, as in the art of the deal, that he's pushing Iran into a corner and forcing them to sign up to a much better deal?
Well, look, I'm very much hoping that this is indeed the first stage of the White House's approach to a next round of negotiations. I mean, we've heard many times what the Trump White House has said about what it said about its predecessors, and so let's hope that this is the opening gambit. But in order for that to work, in order for that gambit to have any success at all, it requires the European powers, including the United Kingdom, to make sure that we are committed to working with Iran too.
Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much indeed. And that was the closing gambit of our show tonight.
President Trump has announced tonight that the United States will abandon the international nuclear deal involving Iran. In a strongly worded statement, he said he would impose the highest level of sanctions against Iran, which he described as a murderous dictatorship. The deal, signed back in 2015, offered a lifting of sanctions in return for limits on Iran's nuclear program. The president had been repeatedly urged by allies, including Britain, not to withdraw in this way. Let's join our correspondent Nick Bryant at the White House this evening.
This could be the most controversial and consequential decision of the Trump presidency so far. It places great strain on his relations with European allies, including Britain. Many think it will escalate tensions in the Middle East. But Donald Trump ardently believes he is making America safe again. With a flourish of his presidential pen, Donald Trump has inked into history one of the most muscular pledges from his America First campaign, one that delivers a potentially fatal blow to the signature foreign policy achievement of his predecessor Barack Obama, one that could put the United States on a collision course with Iran.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
In one of his toughest speeches yet, he said he'd reimpose the highest level of economic sanctions against Tehran.
America will not be held hostage to nuclear blackmail. We will not allow American cities to be threatened with destruction. And we will not allow a regime that chants death to America to gain access to the most deadly weapons on earth. Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them.
The nuclear deal was struck in 2015 between Iran and 6 world powers, including the US, UK and Russia. Iran agreed to limit its controversial nuclear energy program, which international powers feared could lead to the development of a nuclear weapon. In return, stringent economic sanctions were lifted, enabling Iran to sell more oil to other countries and trade more efficiently. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani delivered an almost instantaneous response, saying his country was preparing to restart uranium enrichment, key for making both nuclear energy and weapons.
I have ordered the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran to be ready to start the enrichment of uranium at industrial levels. We will wait a few weeks and speak with our allies. All depends on our national interests.
European architects of the deal, present at its creation 3 years ago, tonight gave a very grim-faced response.
The European Union is determined to act in accordance with its security interests and to protect its economic investments. The nuclear deal with Iran is the culmination of 12 years of diplomacy. It belongs to the entire international community. It has been working and it is delivering on its goal, which is guaranteeing that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons.
But praise from America's closest Middle East ally.
Israel thanks President Trump for his courageous leadership, his commitment to confront the terrorist regime in Tehran, and his commitment to ensure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons. Not today, not in a decade, not ever.
From Barack Obama tonight, a rare public rebuke of his successor. He called Mr. Trump's decision misguided and a serious mistake.
This will make America much safer. Thank you very much.
But Donald Trump is unapologetic. For him, it's promise made, promise kept. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
Well, in Tehran, as we heard there, within minutes of the announcement at the White House, President Rouhani said he was deeply disappointed by President Trump's decision and said there could be no justification for it. And he called on other powers to continue to respect the deal, which is known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, has more details.
Tonight's news in Tehran. State TV's most important headline in years. Trump withdraws from the nuclear deal. Moments later, President Rouhani's turn, flanked by men who spent years negotiating this landmark accord.
From this moment on, the nuclear agreement is between Iran and 5 other countries. And in these circumstances, we have to wait to see how the 5 other countries will react.
Iran's next step depends on Europe. Nearly 3 years ago, Iranians celebrated the end of sanctions, the start of a new relationship with the West. It didn't last long. Today, the Iranian rial fell to near record lows against the dollar. We expected this to happen, this man says on state TV. In or out of the deal, what difference does it make? Even hardliners who oppose the deal may rally around the president for now.
The United States doesn't understand. He is bringing together political opponents in the Iranian system, and he is bringing them together on the wrong side of engagement, and he is going to promote their ideas, hardline ideas of resistance, and that is going to be provocational and also detrimental for Iran's future domestic politics.
The other impact will be in the region. There's one line in this deal which speaks of hope that it will positively contribute to peace and security in the region. But as the deal unravels, the fear is regional tensions will now escalate, especially with Iran's growing influence, everywhere from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon, along Israel's border. And tonight, that tension is mounting. Israel is braced for possible Iranian retaliation after recent airstrikes in Syria, a conflict which intensifies just as a deal meant to prevent a war seems to be falling apart. Lise Doucette, BBC News.
Let's talk a little more about the impact then. In a moment, we'll talk to our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, who's in Erbil in Iraq. We'll be with Jeremy in a moment. First, let's go to Brussels and talk to our Europe editor, Katja Adler. Katja, I think it's fair to say EU leaders had almost begged President Trump not to do this. So what's the thinking there tonight?
Well, there's deep, deep regret across Europe tonight, Hugh, and not a little concern, expressed clearly in a statement by the Prime Minister, issued on behalf of the 3 European signatories to the deal, the UK, France and Germany, all involved in frantic last-minute diplomacy to try and keep the US in the deal. But in the end, Donald Trump's decision doesn't come as a huge surprise. And so behind the scenes over the last months, European leaders, the EU is a key backer of the deal, have been working to try and come up with plan Bs and Cs to keep it alive, whatever the decision from Washington. There was even a last-minute meeting with an Iranian delegation here in Brussels just this afternoon, and there's disquiet in Europe that the US says it could now impose sanctions on countries or businesses that do deals with Iran. Still, European leaders are keeping the door open, optimistically, for Donald Trump to change his mind. They say they'll be working on the main issues in the Iran deal that he most objected to. So an attempt, Hugh, across Europe at putting on a brave face, but privately real anxiety about the long-term viability of the Iran deal and what that means in terms of security.
Katja, many thanks. Let's go to Iraq and talk to Jeremy Bowen there. Jeremy, how do you measure the potential impact of this decision across the region?
I think it could be considerable, Hugh. Here in Iraq, Iran is the most powerful foreign force. And if there is to be pushback of maybe even a military nature against the United States, it may come from Iran's allies in this country. More widely, back in 2015, those countries, those 6 powers who signed the deal with Iran, I think let out a big sigh of relief, because at the time the region seemed to be sliding inexorably into war because of Iran's nuclear plans and because of Israel's response to them. Now, the deal, not perfect, I don't think anybody would say it was, has brought a certain period of calm over the last 3 years, and that is, of course, now going to end because there's a lot of uncertainty. In the Middle East, there are many violent, dangerous and difficult issues, but I think everything surrounding Iran's nuclear plans, or lack of them, they'd claim, to have a nuclear weapon, that's the most dangerous issue in this very, very volatile region. And as for American foreign policy in this part of the world, I think the announcement that President Trump made today will dictate the shape of it for the rest of his time in power, and perhaps will go into his successor's time as well.
Jeremy, once again, thanks. Jeremy Bowen, our Middle East editor in Erbil in Iraq, and Katja Adler, our Europe editor in Brussels.
Donald Trump has tonight made the biggest foreign policy play of his presidency. He has pulled America out of the 2015 Iran deal signed by Barack Obama, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was a campaign pledge, but in doing so, Trump has ignored Angela Merkel, Theresa May, and the man who was his best friend last week, Emmanuel Macron. Tonight, in a joint statement, the 3 European leaders expressed their regret and concern and agreed their continuing support of the deal. When Trump was a presidential candidate, his line was, "We have a horrible contract, but we do have a contract." Now he's announced he'll tear it up and reimpose the highest sanctions. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reacted immediately, calling it a bold decision against a terrorist regime. But will it increase or decrease the likelihood of further conflict in the Middle East? Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
We cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement. The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen.
He then signed an executive order restoring sanctions. There was no plan B announced how else Iran's nuclear ambitions might be thwarted, rather ample evidence that the White House would rather return Iran to sanctions because of its role backing allies in the region.
There's no doubt that Iran has continued to cause a lot of problems across the Middle East, and it certainly doesn't appear that they feel like the deal binds them from continuing to fund terrorism across the Middle East.
The news didn't come as a surprise to the deal's European signatories, and they'd readied their response.
The nuclear deal with Iran is the culmination of 12 years of diplomacy. It belongs to the entire international community. It has been working, and it is delivering on its goal, which is guaranteeing that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons. The European Union is determined to preserve it.
But can European firms carry on trading with Iran if US sanctions are reimposed?
There's going to be a lot of heavy lifting that's going to have to take place in the weeks and months ahead in order to make that a realistic possibility and a reality. I think that the Europeans can take a variety of steps to insulate their firms from US punitive measures, much like the Russians and the Chinese do. I think the Europeans have been hesitant to go down that route because they're worried about further damaging transatlantic ties beyond the damage that Trump has already caused.
America has proven an unreliable signatory to many international agreements. So the Kyoto Climate Change Protocol was never ratified. Similarly, Bill Clinton endorsed the International Criminal Court but never sent it for ratification, and then President Bush revoked the decision anyway in 2002. There was the 2016 Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. President Trump withdrew from that one. So President Obama never framed the Iran deal as a treaty needing to be ratified, relying instead on a rolling suspension of US sanctions against Iran by the presidency.
This nuclear deal and sticking to it is not only a matter of nuclear global security, but also has very important repercussions for the credibility of the sitting US president and also future US presidents to dictate US foreign policy. Because obviously, if everyone is now under the impression that any future US president can undo what a former president has done in terms of international commitments and undertakings, it's going to be very hard to trust that as a counterpart that's reliable going forward.
And what about Iran itself? Polls suggest people there expect a response, but what will it be? Restarting enrichment or something less provocative? Tonight, Iranian President Rouhani pledged to carry on with the deal.
From this moment on, the nuclear agreement is between Iran and 5 other countries. From now on, 5+1 has lost 1. And in these circumstances, we have to wait to see how the 5 other countries will react.
If Europe can come up with a package in which Iran can receive the benefits of the deal, Iran will consider remaining basically within the JCPOA and follow its commitments. But it's very hard to know whether or not that will hold up, and probably there will be some sort of retaliation around IAEA access and enrichment unless Europe does provide a strong signal to Iran that it's going to stand on their side.
Thank you very much.
So President Trump has fulfilled a campaign promise and junked President Obama's principal foreign policy achievement. The world now awaits the consequences.
Well, Mark is with me now. Mark, can we talk a little bit more about whether this deal can survive?
I think there are the near-term questions. Some people suggesting this evening that some kind of re-entering of a discussion about how this could be saved for everyone. There is that kind of talk. I'm not sure I put...
For everyone?
Yeah, but I'm not... That could America re-enter? I'm not sure I put much reliance on it. I don't think Iran would be up for that in those terms. And then there are the slightly longer-term questions. Now, critically, can European countries, China and Russia, carry on trading? I think they can make a good argument that it would be lawful for them to do so, both in terms of their own national laws and the UN Security Council resolution that buttresses this whole deal and which, of course, remains in place. Would America, though, move to take away some of that trade, either by doing secondary sanctions against firms doing it? We don't know.
But there's no sign that they want to do anything about that resolution.
No. And in fact, there was a briefing this evening by John Bolton, the National Security Advisor in the US, that suggested that the US, well, it can't do much about it, because, of course, that would require a vote within the Security Council, and the other countries wouldn't go along with that.
So what about Iran's position? We know what Rouhani said tonight.
Well, the Foreign Minister as well has tweeted tonight that Iran's view of it will be dependent on whether they can find a way through effectively. So if the Europeans, Russia and China can find a way to keep a productive trading and security arrangement in place, Iran seems ready to do that.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Well, I'm joined now by Nazanin Ansari, an Iranian journalist for KNN in London, and from Washington by former Deputy Assistant to the President Trump, Sebastian Gorka, and also Jarrett Blanc. He worked in the US State Department while Barack Obama was president. His job was trying to ensure Iran fulfilled its nuclear commitments, and he now works at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Good evening to you all. I'm going to start with you, Nazanin Ansari. Like the Europeans, was Iran expecting this?
The Iranians were expecting it, and I think they had been saying that they will ask the Europeans for support, and this is something that we have heard also from the think tanks here in London, that all their emphasis is now on Europe to be able to keep the bargain.
What Donald Trump paid a lot of attention to today was that what he's called the sort of spirit of the agreement had been broken, you know, by the support for Assad, by the actions in Yemen, and by the support for Hezbollah, that actually what they were doing is being agents of terror in the Middle East. And he's sort of been saying that no matter what was actually happening with centrifuges, they weren't sticking to the spirit of the agreement.
Certainly, I think when you look at the amount of financial help that Iran is sending to Hezbollah, which, according to Mr. Nasrallah, is helping them logistically with weapons, training. It's estimated to be $1 billion a year. To Syria, it's between $6 to $15 billion a year, different estimates. So all this money that has that JCPOA was supposed to be able to generate for the betterment of the Iranian economy has been diverted internationally.
Now, interestingly, because that, you know, all the millions of Iranians that Rouhani said would then get education and would get work, and there'd be all these foreign companies coming in, does this now put his position in jeopardy?
Well, his position has been in jeopardy because although the Iranian economy, the oil revenues went back to pre-sanctions level, the Iranian economy has suffered. I mean, since December 2017, we are seeing protests and strikes on a daily basis.
So do you think Rouhani will survive?
He has to survive, because if he doesn't survive, it is the system at stake.
Well, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Thank you very much indeed. Sebastian Gorka, first of all, there was absolutely no evidence that Iran was breaking the deal.
Really? Did you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu a week ago?
President Netanyahu was saying that what had been shown for these papers was that prior to 2003 they were working towards this, but there was nothing to say that since 2003 they were. So what I'm asking you is not so much that Iran is actually actively pursuing a nuclear bomb. It's because Donald Trump does not believe the deal is a good deal.
Not at all. If you go back, and I encourage your viewers to go back and watch the full 20-minute briefing from Prime Minister Netanyahu, it is clear from that massive data dump, the hundreds of thousands of documents, half a ton worth of intelligence information, that the Ahmad project, the nuclear warhead project, is still going. Even if they hadn't been in technical breach, which they have been. Look up heavy water and JCPOA, and you will see that Iran is in technical breach as well as being in breach of the spirit of the agreement. The agreement itself is just bad. It doesn't talk about ballistic missiles, and it doesn't stop Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Well, let me put this to Jarrett Blanc.
Sunsets them.
Let me put this to Jarrett Blanc. And according to Sebastian Gorka, the Iranians had broken the deal and were in the process of moving forwards towards nuclear weapons.
No, that's flatly false. That has not been the conclusion of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It hasn't been the conclusion of the U.S. intelligence community. And it wasn't the conclusion of Secretary Mattis at his last testimony. By the way, it also wasn't what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. If I could also just respond to the last thing that Mr. Gorka was trying to say. The idea that the only deal that's a good deal is one that resolves every outstanding point of friction between two adversaries, that's just another way of saying, don't even try diplomacy, let's go straight to war. The JCPOA took the hardest and most important problem, Iran's nuclear program, and it took it off the table. Did it solve every other problem? No. But it did put us in a position to work on those problems. President Trump has now destroyed that position.
But Sebastian Gorka, he may have destroyed that position, you may say, up to a point, Jarrett Blanc, but it looks like the other signatories, the other people that signed up to that UN resolution, can go on trading with Iran. Is that actually what President Trump is happy to see happen?
Not if you look at what our brand new ambassador to Berlin has tweeted out just a few minutes ago. He's given a very clear indication that German companies should desist trading with Iran as soon as possible and wind down their activities. This is the real nub of the issue. The European allies aren't protesting because of some altruistic love of multinational agreements. It's about money. The biggest trading partners to Iran after the JCPOA deal was signed are countries like Germany and France. So it's filthy lucre yet again.
Well, Jared Blanc,
that's categorically absurd.
Yeah. So can I just put that to Jared Blanc, because the UN resolution still stands, and as Mark Urban said, this might end up in the law courts because despite what Grenell, the new ambassador to Germany, is saying, there is nothing here that says that Europeans can't trade with Iran.
So, first of all, it's categorically absurd that this is about economics for the Europeans. Iran is an insignificant market for Europe. This is about security for the Europeans. They are concerned about Iran's nuclear program. They've solved the problem, and they want to stick with the solution. As to whether or not international firms can continue trading with Iran, as a legal question, the answer is, of course, absolutely yes. The legality of secondary sanctions is very much in question. As a practical matter, the whole deal is really about secondary sanctions. It's about the threat that the U.S. had previously imposed on non-U.S. firms doing business with Iran. And the question really lies with the governments of Europe and the governments of Asia to decide, are they going to go along, even quietly, with the United States, or are they going to take active steps to allow their firms to do business with Iran and therefore protect the benefits Iran received from the deal? It's possible. It's difficult, but it's really a practical issue, not a legal one.
Sebastian Gorka, on the point that Donald Trump was making about, he seemed to be reaching out to the Iranian people and talking about the proud tradition, the proud history, the proud culture. Is Donald Trump seeking regime change in Iran, do you think?
I know he isn't.
This
is not what he believes in. No, he does not believe in regime change. He sees that as fundamentally antithetical to the American way, and he thinks that's not what we're here to do. And I just ask all your viewers, and your guest especially, if you have a problem with what President Trump today did, ask yourself why you are siding with a murderous regime, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, that puts homosexuals in prison and kills people who dissent, shoots women on the street who dissent with the mullahs. Those are the people you're defending, and you should be ashamed of yourselves.
Jared Blanc, are you ashamed of yourself?
No, I'm not siding with the government of Iran. I'm siding with U.S. national security interests. Iran is a regional power. We are a great power. We can deal with Iran so long as it does not have a nuclear weapons program or an ambiguous path to a nuclear weapon. We solved that problem with the JCPOA, and I believe in sticking with that solution.
Do you think...
How did the Sunset Clause solve that? I'm so curious. How does the Sunset Clause, which allows them to develop nuclear capacity after 7 years, take it off the table? You're living in a fantasy land, whoever you are.
Jared Blanc, answer that quickly, please.
So the JCPOA, like most arms control agreements, has terms. And like successful arms control agreements, it perceives its own follow-on. So if we had stuck with the JCPOA, had implemented it in good faith, then a few years from now we would go back to the table and figure out the next period with the strong support of our allies and partners. Now we're all alone.
Thank you very much. I just want to put this straight back to Nazanin. What chance do you think that Iran will seek a new deal?
Well, Iran has to be able to continue, the government and the system of Iran has to be able to continue operating financially. Right now it's bankrupt. And so it is in its best interest to seek a new deal. Certainly there have been voices already in the parliament asking, let's put everything on the table. Now, whether the Revolutionary Guards and the architects of Iranian strategy in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, would want to put all their cards on the table, that's another question. But at the end of the day, Iran has to decide whether it is a cause or whether it's a country. And if it's a country, it has to think of its people first.
Thank you all very much indeed.